I want to talk a little bit about philosophically, kind of zooming out a little bit about the nature of revolution and rebellion. This this is a difficult question for me to answer. I don't think I've really found an answer for myself. Um, but what do you think the line is that has to be crossed in order to justify armed rebellion as opposed to peaceful protests, diplomatic and political means?
Yeah, that was again that was something that I was putting my characters into, and it's a difficult question to answer because how what is too much and what is I can take it, but uh, the line is not it was not bright and easy to see during that revolution or any other revolution, and a lot of it was simply that all right, I have made I have made a good faith effort to bring my point of view to the British Crown, and they still refuse to take it. And also now they're besieging Boston, or they're because before that they had shut the port in Boston and weren't allowing stuff in, so people's businesses were going under. That would drive many people into the arms of the revolutionaries, and in fact drive them into the arms of the revolutionaries. Um, but it was still a give and take, and I think the probably you brought up at when they came back and they were at the march of Lexington Concord, when they were marching back from Concord and the British Army started burning houses. That's when people started feeling like, well, the British Army is against me. They're not just against. They're not trying to uphold the laws. No, there's no way the king wants them to burn my house down. So I think it has to be. I think for somebody to make that connection, I think it has to be a clear and present threat to what you believe is your livelihood and lifestyle, and what everything you think is important
And your life too.
in
Um,
your life too. Yes, of course.
but I think it's more often than not sort of a gradual escalation. I mean, this was a conflict that had been brewing for 10 years at that point, probably ever since the Stamp Acts in 65. So is violence justified in achieving political goals? I know that's a big question that's been debated throughout history. I think I think it can be. When you look at oppressive dictatorships, totalitarian tyrants, I think more often than not, the only way you're going to defeat that is through violence, unfortunately.
Right. Well, it's not just that. I mean, I mean, if you were to look at, if we're going to talk philosophically about the violence in general, like look at a lot of these African countries, for example, where right now the borders of many of these countries were drawn in Berlin as opposed to in a conference of Europeans, and they divided up what was traditional and historic empires, and so they have countries that are on countries on the map that we see on the map, but they were never historic countries to the people that live there, and they have people that fought each other. It's like if you drew random circles in Europe and said, "Well, this is now France here," even though it contains a lot of Germans or what have you, and so these countries are the government, whoever is in power in the capital is the official government, and they oppress anybody that wants to break away. The other part of that side is the government's never want anybody to break away. So even if they have no control and what's going on in these other parts of the country, they don't want to let go. So the fighting starts because you want your place. You want your place. What you think is fair, and that happens everywhere. And the Vietnam is another thing. One of the things that people don't know is that Ho Chi Minh actually was seeking before our participation in Vietnam, he was trying to get our help in fighting the Vietnam War. He didn't want the French to come back. He helped fight the Japanese and help knock the Japanese out. Didn't want the French to come back. He was trying to get us to help him, and we didn't, of course, because we got caught up in the communism, the anti-communism thing, and one thing led to another, and we're in Vietnam. So yes, it it's an order of fairness that I think in your place and what and where you think you should be that causes wars, and it gives it where people think that I this is something I've got to fight for.
Yeah, and oftentimes it can be sort of a checks and balances to check people who kind of overstep. A lot of people say peace through strength, but to play devil's advocate on that, in terms of to push back a little bit, in terms of that argument that historic homelands and borders and the nature of that discussion, Putin invaded Ukraine because he, in his mind, throughout history, believes that the Ukraine territory is rightfully Russian. So then oftentimes that can lead to negative consequences.
Well, he believes that they're Russian, but the Ukrainians obviously believe that they're not. And so he denies the essence of the argument. He claims they're Russians, while they're saying no, we're not. We're Ukrainians. So the the argument kind of, and I know you're just being devil's advocate, but you're kind of turning the argument on its head. He's not actually reclaiming Russian territory. He's claiming what he thinks is Russian territory, but he's actually claiming Ukrainian territory. He knows it's Ukrainian territory, and he just denies the existence of Ukrainians. They actually have the same problem in Turkey with the Kurds. They're claiming that Kurds are really just mountain Turks, as they call them, when they have a completely different language, and they have almost a constant civil war going on in the south and east parts of that country because of the fact that they don't or Kurds don't think they're mountain Turks. They think they're Kurds, and they deserve a place of their own.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. The argument definitely gets flipped on its head with Russia and Ukraine because we talk about the nature of violence in achieving political goals. Um, but Ukraine isn't the one who's initiating the violence. Putin invaded Ukraine, so it's not like the Ukrainians are using violence to achieve their freedom or political goals. They were a sovereign country that was invaded. So I do think by nature the argument is kind of flipped on its head there.
Right, and actually, yeah, Russia had recognized the Ukraine in international bodies, internet, all kinds. They signed all kinds of agreements and treaties with Ukraine. The whole thing was a part of Putin's attempt to reimpose the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Empire, and not really what he thought of as his country. His country, in his mind, is was the Soviet Union, and Russia was the leader of that country, and he's trying to reimpose Russia's place in that thing. But again, it doesn't. It's funny how when the Soviet Empire fell, all those republics instantly became independent, and none of them wanted Russia back. All of them have been resisting. Even Belarus, who was our practically, I don't know how if you can distinguish between Belarusian, Russian, and languages.
Forgive me for getting into Russia and Ukraine. But so that you would say that is Putin's motive. Basically my question is, what exactly is Putin's motive? You think he still sort of carries that legacy of the Soviet Union? Because a lot of times I think, I'm only 22. I didn't live through the Cold War. But it seems that a lot of people kind of forgot about the Cold War. Our leaders, most of them are older. These guys lived through the Cold War, and experienced that. And Putin grew up and lived through the Cold War. I believe he was a KGB spy in the Soviet Union. So you think he still kind of carries that legacy of the Soviet Union and almost wants to, reinstall it in some type of way?
Yeah, there's a really good book written by a guy named Benedict Anderson. The name of the book is Imagine Communities, and his argument is, and I agree with it, is that countries really are you are imagining a country as this is my country. Uh, Birds don't pay any attention to where national boundaries are. There's no geological references in many of the cases. They're just places. They're places we think they are, and if we weren't here, those countries wouldn't exist. If we didn't exist, so they exist. The countries exist between our ears. For Putin, the country that exists between his ears is the Soviet Union, and he's trying to rebuild that country. And they're all to a degree imagined countries. Again, like the American, we go back to the Revolutionary War. All the Americans at that time or at least the white American, white Americans of British origin, all thought of themselves as Englishmen, and they'd say, "I'm in." If you asked them who they were, that what their nationality was, they'd say, I'm an Englishman." And again, as an imagined community, because they were not living there. They were living in the North America, but on the part of the British who lived in England and served in the British Army, America was a foreign land that they had to travel to. So they had completely different views on what was happening here, and what they did not envision their England as being, including North America, other than as a possession, not as a land, a traditional homeland.
That's so fascinating. Kind of the role of nationalism in all of this.
Yes, absolutely.
How does the legacy of the American Revolution impact today and our current understanding of civil disobedience and rebellion? Obviously, we have the Bill of Rights, and our Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. And obviously, there's a huge heated debate over that. But I think ultimately the founders intended that as, um, the civilians have a right to bear arms in case the government ever oversteps and oppresses them, and they have the right to sort of rebel against that, like they did. So I think this stuff kind of still impacts us today.
Well, slightly, I have a slightly different take on that, and I think there's a lot of constitutional scholars would argue that the Second Amendment was the right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia, and militias are defined quite precisely in the Constitution, is that they're designed to put down rebellions. They're not. So the intent of arming the militias is not for anti-government moves. That's treason. The arming the militias is to put down anti-government forces. There's a whole lot of other angst inside of that as well. But how does the American Revolution transmit across the centuries to us? And I think that the ideals of the revolution have transformed not only us but the whole world. And I would say, for example, the Civil War. Civil War was the unfinished business of the American Revolution. Eight of the are the one of my main characters in there, Quack, was named after Quack Walker, who was an enslaved African American in Massachusetts. At the end of the Revolutionary War, he said, "Hey, the Constitution says that all men are created equal. I'm a man. I shouldn't be enslaved." And the Massachusetts Supreme Court agreed with him, and he was freed. And that set it off a domino effect that freed not only all the slaves in Massachusetts, but all the slaves in New England. And by I think it's 1804, 8 of the 13 colonies had freed their slaves. They did not in the South, because the slavery, or the free access to free labor, was a cornerstone of the economy down there, and they had a hard time, or they did not believe that they could keep their economy the way it was, and release all the slaves. So that was a problem. But ultimately, the rest of the Americans, and even the Americans in the South, thought that slavery was a unfinished institution, and is something we should resolve. And so it's an idea, or a thesis that I have recently, is that the American Civil War, was the unfinished business of the American Revolution.
No, I think I definitely agree with that. Sort of the biggest hypocrisy and flaw of our founding generation was their inability to deal with that issue.